Well, good morning. It's good to see all of you here on this holiday weekend. It's good to not always take a holiday from church. It's great to be here. And my name is Beth Lilly, and my husband and I retired to Wilmington to live near our son a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And we usually sit back in that amen corner back there. But I've been happy to be in the mix this summer to help with our 2-site summer worship. And today is the last day out at Mount Lebanon. But I'm glad you're keeping me company here this morning. What I like about the Gospel of Mark and what I like about the letter of James is that they are both so clear and straightforward. The writer of Mark wants to get straight to the point that Jesus is the Messiah and that following him is the best idea anyone can have. It moves along really quickly. It's a good gospel to start with if you're ever wanting to recommend a gospel for someone to get started with. Mark is the Apostle Peter's rendition of the life of Jesus as penned for him by John Mark, probably some 20 years after the ministry, after Jesus walked the earth, 20 years into the life of the church, that has given all of them very helpful perspective. And that's the tempo and tone of the Gospel of Mark give you a sense of that enthusiastic temperament of Simon Peter. So it kind of captures that apostle. And in his letter, James, the brother of Jesus, who was the leader of the early church in Jerusalem, maybe wrote his letter to those early followers who were mostly Jewish, the ones there in Jerusalem in the church. Maybe he was responding, this is a maybe, but maybe he was responding to a number of questions and issues that had come up over the years. It's almost like, if you read the whole letter of James, it's almost like a manual with bullet points in it of this is how this should go. It's very practical. It's a very wonderful book, and it almost didn't make it into the canon, but that's another sermon. It's probably a Sunday school class. But it's just a very practical, wonderful book. So thank you, James. But in our gospel today, Jesus strongly challenges the scribes and Pharisees who have brought up the subject of hand washing, and he does not soft pedal his words at all. In fact, he gives quite a list of all the terrible things that can come from the human heart. Thanks, Jesus. But the hand washing that is being discussed here is not actually about sanitation or getting rid of germs. That's our go-to because we're the ones that get our serve safe certificates if we work in a restaurant or if we own the restaurant to try to get that 100% sanitation grade A. But for the Pharisees, the hand washing was the performing of a ceremonial ritual for God, and it was the ritual that was important. And let's face it, in this little story that we have here, they were baiting Jesus. They were, I would say, treating Jesus kind of like their political opponent, trying to point out the bad and start a war of words. But Jesus is always more capable and ready. He's always ready. But as a bit of background about these rituals, about 400 or 500 years before Jesus came into the world, the religious leaders of Israel found it important to write hundreds of detailed laws, hundreds and hundreds, detail after detail, laws and rituals, expanding the meaning of the laws of Moses, which we find set out in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, but they expanded even more from Leviticus and all of that. It's incredible the detail to which they went, but they did it in good faith. They were hoping to make it easier for everyone to please God. That was their aim. And these writings later, after Jesus' time, became known as the Mishnah or Mishnah. And the purpose of Mishnah still today for the Jewish people is to ensure that the oral teachings and traditions of the Jewish laws and the cultural life can withstand the test of time. This was their intent. So I don't want to throw them totally under the bus. But here's what the hand washing ritual was that they were calling out the disciples for not doing. And it was all written, including the amount of water that should be used. First, they were supposed to, and they had to do this before every meal. They were supposed to hold their hands like this, get their hands wet with at least 3 or 4 eggshells of water, something like that. And then they took this fist and scrubbed this hand, and that fist and scrubbed the other hand. And then they were to turn their fingers downward and rinse again or wash again to get that dirt off. It was just but it was all done very piously, and it was very much a ritual. Now, I kind of like the idea of any chef at a restaurant preparing my dinner. I like for him or her to do their hands this much, or maybe, I think about surgeons getting ready to do surgery, how much scrubbing, but that's for a purpose of sanitation, which we all appreciate. But Jesus tells these religious leaders, as far as they are in charge of what they teach to the people, and the people are oppressed by Rome as it is, but Jesus tells them how very off they are. He points out how they've gotten so caught up in the minute details of following all these rituals, and they become so very legalistic and become just too caught up in it, that he in essence tells them they've lost the heart of the law, that they are lost, and their hearts for God are actually lost. He calls them hypocrites, and in another part of the book calls them blind guides. You've all heard the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. These words which I command you today shall be on your heart. Jesus, being a Jew, he knew the Shema. He prayed that prayer as well. And later on in Mark chapter 12, we see that he says it, and then Jesus says the Shema, and then he says, and the second is this, love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. This is the heart that he wanted the Pharisees to know they should get back to. In my own life, I have a quick little vignette to tell you about. Looking back 23 years ago this month, in the month of September, in the small town of Newton, North Carolina, which is in Catawba County outside of Hickory, my husband Tom and I were part of a small group of people who started a soup kitchen in our little town. We called it the Corner Table. There were many compelling reasons for how it came about, and the community spirit was amazing to see. The spirit welled up after 9/11, but we had, with the closing of furniture factories and textile mills, even in our small town, we had just seen so many people obviously in need of something. They'd be walking around. It was heartbreaking. So this was back before Google, if anybody can even imagine back that far. I couldn't go on the internet and say, Google, how do you start a soup kitchen? But we had the guidance of 20 years experience from the Hickory Soup Kitchen, they offered to be our mentor and our umbrella until we got our 501c3. So it took several months to organize it, and it took attorneys and city officials and clergy and church leaders from all around the town and many, many volunteers. And we also had to find a place to get started. So on Wednesday, January the 8th, 2002, after the blessing of the space, which was a scout hut, and there was a stove, an oven back there, but only 2 of the burners worked. We served our first meal to 9 people. And I was given the honor of serving the first meal. I took the tray out to a gentleman. I think his name was James. And honestly, I remember trying really hard not to boo-hoo all over his food, because I felt like, in my heart, I was taking this meal to Jesus. That's how it felt. So fast forward to today, the Corner Table served this summer its 1 millionth meal. And now it is an umbrella for 3 food ministries, a community kitchen, the county's backpack program for school children, and a frozen meals program for those who are sick or shut in. And the executive director and her staff and the many, many wonderful volunteers do an amazing job. It is a very, very busy organization all year long. And I still get emails as a board member emeritus, but it's just always a busy place. And back in the early stages of pulling it together, there were many complications, there were many roadblocks to overcome, there were heartaches, there were challenges. Everything from how to handle food safely, how to store it safely, all these different boxes that we had to check to be sure we were doing it right. And we got a good CPA to help us with the money part for a 501c3. But sometimes it felt very overwhelming, and we would get really caught up in the details. But my very favorite stories to tell you at some point are the many, many miracles, both small and large, that happened. Absolute miracles that happened to help us along the way so that we knew God really was in the mix with us. When I felt like I was off track from all of the details that we were trying to keep up with, what I would do is I would go in and volunteer with the cook team and help cook lunch. And it was 150 to 200 meals by then that we served a day. And then I'd go out in the dining room and visit with the guests. And by then we did have our own building that was formerly a restaurant. We weren't in that scout hut anymore. I just realized I didn't say that at the first service. We had a commercial kitchen. But there was something so amazing each time we first opened the door, when it was time to open up and serve lunch, and the first guests walked in. That gave me that same feeling that I had the day that I took the meal to the first person. It got a lump in my throat, made my heart feel like I was getting right back on the right track for why we were doing what we did. So the truth about me today and our gospel lesson is that it's very relatable to me. In fact, as uncomfortable as it is to admit, in this story, I probably identify with the Pharisees better than I do with the disciples. Hate to say that, but that's why I remembered about the corner table, because I remember getting so caught up in how we do this right, and we got to get this right, and we have to do this right, and check this box. I got off track as well. But all of our lives can become complicated, yes? And do we ever stop and think about how we ever get off track? Of course we do, and we're only human, and yet we live in a time where so many voices compete for our attention. We have so many options at our disposal. We also never seem to run out of difficulties that need to be overcome, either individually or as a group or as a nation. But each one of us here today has our own unique story, the journey that we have been on. And at the same time, all of us can relate somehow to these scriptures, to these hymns. There's always something for every one of us in a worship service. And that's the good news today, that here we are. Jesus speaks to us still. We are worshiping here today in a beautiful and sacred space. Other members in our church family are at Mount Lebanon in another beautiful space, of a different nature. But we're all in this particular part of God's beautiful world, and we are each created in God's image, just like the rest of creation, in God's eyes, the most important eyes that we need to worry about. We are beautiful and we are good. God sees us. We are known and we are loved. We know that whenever we do get lost, God seeks us like the shepherd who seeks the lost sheep. Our God is always reaching toward us. Jesus is our guide along the way. Ours is a way of love. And yes, Jesus is our how-to above any other how-to that we could ever find. This way of love is not without sacrifice, and it's not always the easiest of ways, and yet it is the clearest way to always begin. and we can always begin again. So let us encourage one another to keep our hearts connected to God, first and foremost, because that is how we find our way back to where we each need to be in our journeys. It always works. It never fails. Thanks be to God. Amen.